Welcome to Fairygodboss webinar. I am Ngozi Obona, the head of performance marketing at Fairygodboss, the largest career community for women. And I am excited to have you join us for the Memo, What Women of Color Need to Secure a Seat at the Table, Fireside Chat with Minda Harts. Minda is the CEO of the Memo, a career development platform for women of color. She is the best-selling author of the Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table. She's also an assistant professor at NYU Wagner. She's been featured on MSNBC's Morning Joe, Fast Company, The Guardian, Time Magazine, among others. And she frequently speaks at companies like Microsoft, Levi's, Google, Bloomberg on topics such as leadership, managing diverse teams, and self-advocacy. And she also hosts a weekly podcast called Secure the Seat. Minda, thank you so much for joining us. And what an incredible bio.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Excellent. At Fairygodboss, we encourage women to brag about themselves. So before we dive into our chat, I would love for you to share one brag.
Oh, wow. I think just having a best-selling book, my agent, she went out to 5 publishers and 4 of the major ones said no. So the fact that it became a bestseller, I'm going to brag about that. So it wasn't anything that I did, but it's the community. And so I'm so thankful.
That's an excellent brag. Congratulations. And first question, as a woman of color, especially a Black woman, I'm well aware that the workforce can be a very challenging place for us. And I'm curious about how did you get that memo and what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I spent 15 years in corporate and nonprofit roles, and I was always the only one or one of very few. And you start to settle into isolation. You start to settle into the microaggressions and the bias. And sometimes you just try to make everything work. And I realized that I needed to make the workplace better than I found it. And so that meant not just diversity, but what would it feel like to be included and belong? And so I know that many women who look like us tend to leave the corporate America or nonprofit organizations because they don't feel seen, right? They don't have the opportunities that many of our counterparts do. And so I didn't want any of us to keep deferring our dreams due to toxic workplaces or managers or leaders that just aren't invested in our success. And so crazy enough, this is the first book I've been told by a major publisher about the experiences of women of color and Black women in the workplace. And so I'm just honored for us to be able to read our stories in the career narrative. And so that was the reason, right? We have so many broken hearts and trauma, and that I just wanted us to be able to feel included in that workplace narrative.
Okay, and a quick note to our audience, we will be leaving some time at the end of the webinar for some questions, so please use your Q&A. Use the Q&A box to answer or to ask any questions, and we'll address them towards the end of the webinar. And it's really great that you brought up the experiences of women of color, especially Black women. I've read a lot of quotes from some of them about feeling underappreciated, unsupported, disrespected, alone. How do you think workplaces can better support women of color and help set them up for success?
Yeah, what's interesting about that is now we actually have the data to back up our feelings, right? So before it was these feelings that we had, and some people would dismiss them as, oh, you're, in your feelings or you're in your head. And now we actually have this statistics to say, hey, it's not just feeling and it's fact. And over 70% of women of color feel like their managers are not invested in their success. 1 in 25 women of color are advanced into the C-suite, whereas 1 in 5 white women are. And so you have a lot of these things. So if you look at the C-suite, for example, less than 4% of the C-suite leadership are women of color. So there is some correlation between your managers being invested in your success, seeing you as a winner. And I think that we have to equip our managers to manage diverse talent if that's something they're not comfortable doing. And so, again, there's so many women of color with so much talent. How much talent do we want to use in the workforce? And we're just not tapping into that brilliance. And so I hope that through the memo, managers will see themselves and say, hey, how am I getting the most out of my team and their needs and wants?
Great points. Are there specific ways that you think we can engage managers, allies, sponsors to better address the issues and really drive tangible change?
Yeah, part of writing the book was, yes, calling out systemic issues that have been rooted in workplace culture, but then also what would it look like if we took our careers by our own hands, right? And be the curator of our own career. And that would sometimes require self-advocacy. So if you don't have a manager that is invested in your success, what would it look like for you to manage up, right? Be clear on the things that you want and come to those one-on-ones with an agenda and say, this is what I want out of the workplace. Can you help me achieve these goals? And I think oftentimes, I know in my career, I was doing all the things and I was working really hard, hoping that someone would come and tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, girl, it's your time, it's your turn. And it just didn't happen that way. I had to get out in front and be my best advocate. So I think once we get clear on what we really want, finding those mentors, those sponsors, those peer mentors to really help us get in the room, or even when we're not in the room, speaking our praises. So it's really up to us to make sure that the right people know what we want.
Sure. Could you provide an example in your career where that did help you, whether it was engaging a sponsor or having someone that really took up for you and elevated you in your position?
Yeah, I hope everyone watching will go and get the memo. And I have a whole chapter called Building Your Squad, and it talks about that time where I was working really hard. And I think as women of color, and women in particular, sometimes we just have been told, just get in there, work hard and put your head down. And while you're working hard and putting your head down, there's all these other things. People are getting promoted and all these other things are happening while we're getting there early and leaving late. And so once I realized that this whole other game was being played, I realized that I needed to be at the after 6 activities, the out of office activities, for people to see my face. And even though I may not have felt like going out to the happy hours or going to the break room birthday parties, I needed to be seen. I needed for them to be able to see me and know that, I exist, right? That I am visible and that I'm working here. And so once I started to just find out who the movers and the shakers are within the company, finding people who I can connect with and who could be future mentors, future sponsors. And for me, it was being seen. I called it FaceTime. In the book, I tell about a story of there was a C-suite executive that was on the floor I worked in. And so whenever he would be in the office, we all traveled like 80% of the time. And so when he did have a standing appointment, I would make sure that, I was passing by his office so he'd see my face. And eventually I built out, from just him seeing my face to saying hello and building on those. It took about 6 months. And then I finally had the courage to say, hey, Bob, do you mind if I, get on your calendar and da 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 da. And from there, he became a sponsor, but it took time, right? He wasn't checking for me. I had to make sure that he knew the work I was doing. So when I saw him in the elevator and he says, hey, Minda, how's it going? I don't just say, oh, Bob, it's going great. I say, hey, Bob, it's going great. And I'm really excited about these projects I'm working on, making everything count. And I think once we lean into that, we can really make some things pop for us in the workplace.
Yeah, it's funny because, in the Fairygodboss community, a lot of people are asking about mentors. How can they find mentors or sponsors? And I think it's important to know that doesn't necessarily have to be a formal process or a formal relationship. What are some tips in terms of how to engage someone or try to develop that relationship that could potentially turn into a mentorship, whether it's formal or informal?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because that's something that a lot of people reach out to me about, like, oh, I need a mentor. How do I find a mentor? And we live in a world where even online, you can build your social capital, right? You don't have to have this note that you slide across the table. Will you be my mentor? Check yes or no. It can really happen organically. You don't even have to really know the person or live in the same community. You get online, like for example, for me, I use a lot of Twitter and LinkedIn, and I follow the people who are inspiring to me because they're always giving advice, right? And I take that advice as if they're sitting across the table from me. And it doesn't have to be so formalized. We get to create in that chapter, Building Your Squad. I talk about creating your top 8. I'll date myself a little, but back when MySpace was around, you had a top 8. Make your,
yes.
create your top 8 and find those people. You don't have to know them. And I think once we get out of our head that this person has to know us or meet with us, we get to meet every day online, depending on how we want to engage. And I ask people who I admire or who have done similar things that I want to do in the future, you know, I tweet them, I follow them on LinkedIn, I engage in conversation. And those are ways that I build my mentorship. And also knowing that mentorship, it creates relationship building, right? And so sometimes you can't just slide in someone's DMs or direct message and say, can you be my mentor? But, you know, show up at the conferences they're at, you know, buy their books, tweet out something, get really strategic. The internet really takes the barrier away. You can be in Greenville, Mississippi, and, you know, be at a conference virtually in Toronto, right? And so there's so many ways that we can go about finding and building those mentors. Don't let that physical aspect detour you. And just like the workplace, be in the spaces where people that need to know you are and start to build from there.
So is it important to have a social media presence, whether it is on Twitter or LinkedIn? I think you should definitely have a LinkedIn profile and have it be fully robust and complete. But do you think it's important that that in addition to making sure that you are, you know, doing your job in the office, that you're also thinking about your personal brand from a social media perspective?
Yeah, I think now the way that careers are going, we're very multi-dimensional. And so if you want to be a thought leader in the space, depending on it, let's say diversity, inclusion, and equity, for example, if that's something that you're interested in, you can use a professional platform like LinkedIn or something that you can post thoughts and pieces and engage with people that you're interested in engaging with. But then, and I think LinkedIn provides that opportunity from a professional aspect for you to be able to engage in those things. And then from there, like, you want to engage on other platforms, but I do think you should have some online calling card, some place that you can direct people to, or that they can find you, just to know that you're real, right? And that you do have some thoughts. And if you are building your brand, if you don't have a website, but you do have LinkedIn, that's a great way to get started.
Excellent points. And just want to backtrack a little bit. You mentioned about going to after work events, company events. I know a lot of women, they're working moms, you know, they have children that they're taking care of, or maybe, you know, elderly parent, or they just have other responsibilities. And so time-wise, it does get challenging to, you know, spend, you know, 8+ hours at the office, and then, you know, you don't want to keep seeing the same people, you know, after work. So why do you think it's important to have additional face time after office hours, and do go to the company events, even though you may be tired, you do have other obligations that you are battling with your time?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because that is something that even women who've read the book, they'll email me and say, you know what, I never went to anything outside of work, and now I've gone and it's helped me exponentially, you know, just being seen. There's something about being seen and engaging strategically. And so I say, you know, don't go to the happy hours just to go to the happy hours. Go to the happy hours because maybe Jim or Kim are going to be there, and you need to just have a couple of quick moments with them. So be strategic. And it's not about, you know, getting a drink, order a water with a lime in it, say a couple things, you know, have a karaoke song in your back pocket if you need to. I just think it's a good opportunity for others to see you outside of work, and you to see them, because part of understanding workplace culture, you're not going to get to know your colleagues in the ways that you might need to know them, like who's going to be an advocate for you and who's not, just passing them on the way to get paper out of the printer, right? You have to see them in different environments. And so this is about the intel. And what I found in my career is that a lot of the tea, the office tea, the things that you need to know are happening outside of the cube, right? Are having outside
that's true.
of the office. So maybe you do have children or you have responsibilities, so you don't go out every night, right? But maybe a couple times a quarter, or you before work, maybe you ask a couple colleagues to you know, start a book club. Like, there's so many ways. You don't have to get fixated on the happy hours, but just make sure that you're building relationships, because what's key is that people are speaking your name when you're not there. People can't vouch for you, or they can't think about you for opportunities if they don't know you. And I think as women of color, we really have to, unfortunately, get in these spaces in which these conversations are happening. Otherwise, we're not going to be thought of when these opportunities arise.
Yeah, that is a great point. It used to be that, you just keep your head down and focus on working and your work would speak for itself, but you have to participate in the politics and unfortunately, your work is not enough. It is really about the relationships you're building and who and how you're managing up and around you.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times we'll be sitting in the queue and we'll be like, how did Kim get ahead? Or how did Kim, I have the numbers and this, and it's like, well, Kim went to the break room birthday parties. Kim knew that Bob likes red velvet cupcakes. These are the things that we missed out on when we left, when we were working hard with our head down. And I'm not saying that work ethic is not important, right? But there's so many more dimensions to that likability factor. But again, one thing that I'm really clear on in the book, if that's not what you want, if you don't want the seat or you don't want to engage in that way, then you also have that option too. But if you do want to move different inside the workplace and you want to hear about other opportunities, then it's important to build your social capital inside of the workplace.
And, along with that, we keep hearing about you should bring your authentic self to work, be yourself, bring your true self. Is that practical advice? Do you think it's possible to bring your true self to work while still navigating and acclimating to the politics at play?
I think it's a fine line, but I often think about whose version of authenticity are we talking about when we hear leaders saying that, right? And so we understand that each of us is inside of a certain workplace culture. And I know that I don't want to see my coworkers' full authentic self. If they're being microaggressing me and this is their best version of them, I don't want them to bring their best selves to work, right? So, so I think we have to be clear on who we want to be inside of the workplace and ask ourselves that question. Who do you want your colleagues to see? Who do you feel good about showing up as in the morning or in the evening or on the weekends, and put that back on you. So center yourself in the career narrative. If it's, I haven't worn my hair natural in ages because I don't feel comfortable in the office setting, ask yourself, could I do this on Monday? Could I wear my hair naturally? Because this is part of me. Now you have to decide what parts of yourself you want to show up as, because we know that still office politics are still in play, right? And so you can show up any way you want to, but that certain things culturally will be accepted and won't. But I do want to pose, Ashanti said it best, all the things that we accept be the things that we regret. So don't accept anything that you're going to regret later. So make sure that you're centering yourself in terms of that office culture.
So I have a question come in about how this advice can be applied to introverts. And I can relate to that. I consider myself an extroverted introvert. I can be very chatty and social, but also, can at times be shy and really reserved. And so as you're looking to, bring yourself to work and be more social and active in the work culture environment, how can introverts or people that have a tough time maybe with public speaking or have a tough time, promoting themselves and bragging about themselves, how can they better navigate the workforce?
Yeah, that's another great question. And to be 100% honest, I am an introvert. And a lot of people will joke and say, I can't believe it, Minda, but I worked very, very hard to get this version of myself here. And I'm still working really hard on that. But what I realized was, even at my core, being an introvert, I knew that I couldn't let that shyness stop me from getting my seat, right? And so I needed to let my curiosity be larger than my fear. And I said, what are those things I'm going to do to build my toolkit so that I can put myself out there? And one of the things I did was take public speaking course, because I knew 10 years ago that in order to be at any table, I'm going to need to use my voice, right? For myself and for others. And so I don't want to just take up space and just be happy to be at the table. I want to make it impactful in the rooms that I enter. And so even 10 years ago, before I even had a seat at the table, I took an improv class. It scared the crap out of me. And I pushed myself in that. It was a 6-week course. When they said bark like a dog, you barked like a dog. When that happened, I never wanted to return back, but I kept coming back. And from there, I took Toastmasters, and I took another course called Own the Room. And I connected with a public speaking coach because I knew that these things I needed in my toolkit. And it's funny because if you would have asked me 10 years ago, would you be public speaking or being on stages? And I would have told you, heck no. Okay. Like even just a couple of years ago, I not even a couple years ago, I think it was last year, I was so nervous because I was going to be interviewing someone that I really admire on stage. And literally 10 minutes before I had to hit the stage, I was in the bathroom, like over the toilet. You know, like I still feel the nerves. And I know it's lunchtime, so I'm sorry. But I'm just telling you, we have to push through. Let your curiosity be larger than your fear. And it's small acts of courage, right? You don't have to show up at the work party break room and be like, hey, it's me, you know, I'm here. Find 1 or 2 people that you're engaging with. Ask for coffees, you know, one-on-one at lunch, or take someone out to lunch. It starts there, just building those relationships. So do it at your comfort level. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon, but you have to be doing something. You can't hide behind the introvert thing, which is a real thing, but we can't let that stop us from what we want.
Yes. So we have a bunch of really great questions coming in. So definitely keep them coming. If you have more, hit the Q&A button and type them. So one question I thought was really interesting was around being one of the few people of color. The question was, how can you navigate the relationships, and were you in environments where they were supportive, or was it a little contentious where it was competitive?
So for me, when I was the only one, it still wasn't a competitive environment because you were dealing with some of your colleagues, right, that wanted to be in the #1 spot. When I worked around other people of color, it was never, I was never in a situation where I worked with others on the same like title as me, so we didn't have that kind of competition. But what I will say is, in the book, I write about a very tough chapter, a time in my life that was really difficult, chapter 4, called "Everybody Can't Be a Golden Girl." And I had been used to being one of the only ones at work, but when I entered in this new environment, it was a toxic work environment, right? Like before, I was dealing with subtle microaggressions. When I entered this new environment, it was blatant, and I didn't know how to really cope with that. I had never experienced that, and it was one of those situations where I was in even more isolation because I didn't have anybody to talk to. And I didn't think, as a woman of color sometimes, or as a Black woman, I felt like I couldn't let people know that I was hurting, right? That I was experiencing this pain. Like I moved across the country to get this job. It's great money, a great title. Like, I'm not going to complain. I'm going to make this work. And I realized that I was trying to make something work at the expense of my own well-being. And by the time I left that place, I was so internally broken that I didn't even recognize myself in the same person as I had walked in the door. And so I just want to let you all know that you know when you're being mistreated, you know when it's a toxic environment. And so you don't have to make anything work. You strategize to make sure that you're putting yourself first, because, you know, when you look at your overall career life, was it worth it? Did you give a certain place the best years of your life, and in return, they did not give you that? And so I think that take that time to really heal and find your space. And Audre Lorde said it best. She said, beware of feeling like you're not good enough to deserve it. You deserve to be in an environment where you're thriving and not just surviving. And so we all know what that could feel like. So give yourself that opportunity to be free in that way. I hope that answers the question, but definitely get the book, because I have so many things in there that'll be helpful for many of you, I hope.
Yes. So one question specifically around microaggression. The viewer mentioned about, you know, how the question is about how do you approach the situation without causing a fight, essentially addressing it, because a lot of the times some people, you know, have unconscious biases, and they may not be aware that what they're saying is offensive, and they're not trying to be mean, but you do want to address it because it can be hurtful. So how do you approach or deal with microaggressions when you see them occurring in the workforce?
Yeah. I think this is a really good, it goes back to the relationship building aspect as one area, because I think if we build relationships with certain people in the workplace, then maybe we don't have to carry such a heavy load, right? We don't have to manage the emotion and try and correct people. If there's someone that considers themselves an ally, or in my book, I call a success partner, if you see something happening, that you don't leave it to just that person to address it, right? And so, for example, in the book, I talk about one microaggression where I picked up my manager from the airport, and it was I had orange fingernail polish on, and when he got in the car along with another male colleague, he says, "You people love your bright colors." And then he went on to joke for another 15 minutes as I'm driving this car about Black people loving bright colors. And I didn't feel like I could say anything. I didn't feel like I should. I was really nervous. And I often think that was early in my career, right? And I didn't know if I could. So I never said anything at that moment. But just think, if my colleague in the back seat would have said, "You know what, Jim, we don't talk that way here," or at least came to me after and said, "You know what, Minda, I failed you in that moment. I'm sorry that I let him make that joke and then I didn't say anything. It will never happen again." Like, I think we have to lean into our courage and be there when it counts. And so don't let it be just that on me to deal with that, right? So for the rest of the day, I'm internalizing what he said, right? Trying to figure out why he said it and still trying to be present in my job. That's a lot. That's a stress. And you figure doing that for like 15 plus, 20 plus, 30 plus years, that takes a toll on you. And so I think that we have to learn to be good humans to each other. You know, if your daughter or your son or someone was in that situation, would you want them to have to endure that? Be that for somebody. But then on the flip side, you know, if I had to go back and tell my 24-year-old Minda, I would have addressed him when we got out of the car and say, "You know what, Jim, that was inappropriate. It made me feel some kind of way. I know you may not have meant that, but I just want to let you know that that's not okay." Because I often think, because I didn't say anything, would he go on to make other women of color feel bad about their bright colors again? You know, so reminding ourselves that it's not just about us, right? If we don't talk about these things, then the next generation is going to be dealing with the same thing.
Yeah, and these conversations are hard and it can be uncomfortable, but you're right. Addressing something in the moment, especially when it is hurtful, will definitely at least help you get your feelings out there, and maybe alert the person to what they're doing, and hopefully will change some behaviors.
Yeah, and the other point I want to make is we can't, once you, if it bothers you enough, right? Because oftentimes we're going to replay that scenario over and over and over in our head, right? And they've moved on, they're having their latte, they're living their best life, and we're still thinking about it. And what would it look like to center ourselves? And you can't control what their response is going to be, but you can control how you feel about it, right? So you can say something, and if they don't respond in the way that you don't have to manage that part of it. Just make sure that you're learning how to center yourself and your feelings, because that's a lot to carry.
Yeah, and it's, you know, work can be traumatic, not only stressful, but, you know, especially if it's a toxic environment. And so I think self-care is super critical, taking care of yourself, your mental, your physical, your emotional health. What are some ways that you have supported your self-care practices and help to inoculate yourself in a way against all the, you know, the external factors that you face on a daily basis?
Yeah, you know, so part of it was knowing when enough is enough. You know, Kenny Rogers says, know when to fold them. And sometimes you got to know that this environment is never going to treat you well, right? No matter how many unconscious bias trainings we have, no matter how many conversations you have. And so at some point we have to say, is this seat even worth it? Is this table? Could there be a better situation? Which I do believe there are, right? But sometimes I think we can get comfortable, or we can think that this is the best it's going to get for me. And it's not. It's that retraining your mind to, again, remember that you deserve better, right? You are the room. You have so much talent. And you know when it's enough, right? And so I think part of that self-care is strategizing. If this is not the place for us, finding that place or building that place that accommodates our brilliance. And the other thing is connecting with lunchtime talks like this, the Fairygodboss, other organizations, finding your tribe, finding your squad, knowing that you don't have to suffer in silence and that you can be each other's support system, because, you know, we're in this together and we are what we've been waiting for. We just have to connect with people so we don't have to. So part of mine is making sure I'm in rooms with like minds and not just holding all that in, because again, that workplace trauma is so insidious that we've held so much on it. So we have to learn to pack light, as Erykah Badu said.
Yes. I love Erykah Badu. So, you know, we've read your book, we've taken your advice, applied the tools that you've laid out, and finally secured a seat at the table. How do you keep it? And how do you secure the seat for others as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of securing our seat, and whatever that means to you, right? You can only decide on what that means. But ultimately, once we get in the room, we get that seat, it's bringing more of us, right? So that we don't have to be the only one. So we don't have to keep talking about some of the cultural aspects of, you know, I had one woman say, you know, every day somebody's touching her hair at work. And I think, you know, this is it's absolutely ridiculous, but we need more people in the space so that we change what normal is to a lot of people, right? And I think it's so important that we own these spaces, we be on the front line of our own issues, because people can't, if we're not in the room and they're making decisions for Black women, for women of color, for those who are underrepresented, then they're not thinking about being inclusive, right? And so we have to be in those rooms so that we're making change, so that we're helping make the workplace better for the next generation. And so again, there were people who fought. It's Black History Month. There were people who fought on the front lines for us. We are direct beneficiaries of their courage. And so what is our courage going to look like when we lean into it, so that we do get in these rooms and make sure that future Black women and women of color are getting paid what they deserve, that they're having the titles that they work so hard for, and that their dreams are not deferred. So that's part of securing the seat. The more that we use our voice, right? I can't be the only one talking about the memo. You got to talk about it too. You got to shed a light on some of these workplace inequalities so that our counterparts know that these things are happening. And the only way we can change it is if we do it together.
Absolutely right. So I have a great question that came in. Can you give some practical advice about your process of identifying and honing in on what you bring to the table? What are some ways you strategically planned your next career step?
Yeah, that's a really great question. In the book, there's a chapter called Invest in Yourself. And I actually have templates in there that talk about owning kind of your career narrative and what that looks like. But first, you have to get really clear on what you want out of your career. I think many of us have been told, you know, go to college, get the good job, make it work. And, you know, sometimes we haven't really decided or haven't figured out what it is we like doing, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses, what our weaker areas are that we can enhance to make them strengths. And so I use one framework that I use in the book is similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all have like basic needs in this pyramid. And so I ask you to consider your career needs and what it is you need as a basic level all the way up to the top. And so, for example, one of my basic needs, no matter what job I'm taking, is money, right? My basic needs have to, I need the coin. My basic needs need to be able to afford me to be able to pay my high New York rent, right? And
the rent is very high.
So those are like basic, right? Like I can't take a job that's going to underpay me in that way so that I can't pay my bills. And so that's my basic level. And then up the pyramid, the next thing that I need is feedback, right? It's going to be really hard for me to work for a manager that never gives me feedback, be it good or bad. And so that's something that I need, right? So once I get clear on some of those things, the jobs that I apply for, the environments in which I put myself in, I can kind of mirror them to what I want. And I also have a template for your career purpose statement and all those things. And many years ago, this is what I did in 2015 to get to this point in 2019, getting really clear, saying yes to the things I want and no to the things that I don't, because I have this goal, right? I have this thing. And definitely life happens, things happen in the way, but if you're always coming back to center, is what I'm saying yes to getting me closer to this? Or am I compromising? Back to Ashanti, all the things that we accept be the things that we regret. And so I'm not being foolish about what I'm doing, right? I am plotting my path, okay? So
yes, I love the Ashanti references.
But that's just one, but you have to get the book. There's a lot of tons of resources in there.
Yes. Another great question, a couple of them around the same topic. When you already have the seat at the table, how do you navigate getting your point across without coming off as aggressive? Another asked about, women of color, especially Black women, are often labeled as aggressive when they're advocating for themselves, when they're speaking up, or when they're direct. How can you, what are your suggestions for strategies for those who are looking to be more direct and confident in their delivery, but also don't want to be painted as being too aggressive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And especially for women of color, Black women, we sometimes have to have this fine line, like we're on eggshells. Like if I say this, then they might call me the angry Black woman or the feisty this or the docile that. And it is almost like this double Dutch. And it's really, that's another like exhaustion from the workplace, yes. Right? And so part of that too, it goes back really, a lot of things stem from this relationship aspect, because if no one knows me at work and Bob says, Minda's being aggressive today, if nobody knows me, then they could all now paint this new narrative of me and who they say I am, even if that is not who I am. But if going out and having some of these, networking and building relationships, now when someone says, Minda's aggressive, what I hope will happen is that, Karen will say, no, Minda's not that way. I was just with her, the other day, blah, 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 blah. Like people can vouch for your character. They can vouch for who you are, but ultimately you get to take control of the career narrative. And so self-advocacy, it's one tool that you'll always have to flex, right? But if you've built some squad members, some alliances inside the workplace, you won't be the only one that has to speak up for yourself, right? Or if you ask Karen, Karen, we're going into this meeting, I'm going to say X, Y, and Z. It'd be really great if you also said blah, 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 blah. So if somebody does try to say something, that you have these, what I call success partners in place to help you push forward. But the one thing again that I'll say is, for so long, we've been centering the majority, where we're always centering them, that we don't even give ourselves that space to breathe, to be able to say, this is what I want. This is how I'm going to advocate for myself. And so I would ask you to lean into that a little, those small acts of courage, right? And so I often say with my partner, it's not what you said, it's how you say it, right? So if you need an executive coach, or you need something that's going to help you gain influence or in the room, but think about what you want to say before you say it, and make sure you're telling people who you think it might land on them well. But again, we've done it for so long, centering them. What would it look like if we centered ourselves? You can't hold on to what they might say to you, but if they do say you're being aggressive or you're an angry Black woman, put it back on them. Say, in comparison to who? I mean, like who are you referring to? Because oftentimes they won't, right? And so I know it's tough, and I'm gonna tell you, it took years and years and years to get to this point, but I did get my seat at the table, and I'm trying to bring in, with your help, change the way that our narrative has been written. Nobody sent us a memo that said we were angry Black women. We did not sign off on that, right? So that's their narrative. We are redefining who we are and who we want to be at work. And we do have voices, and we do have stories, and we do have feelings and dreams. And so, put yourself first.
Yes. Astute advice. So in terms of your book, what do you hope, what are the one or two or even three top things that you want people to take away after reading your book?
Yeah, one of the things is seeing yourself in the career story. I think it's something so beautiful to see yourself when you're reading, right? So many books that I read before mine, I did not see myself in them. There's so many business books and career books written by people that don't look like me, that don't even consider what it's like for me to show up at work. And so this was a love letter for you to be able to say, wow, yeah, me too, right? And I used a lot from our culture to be able to really to use art and rap and activism to be able to tell a story in which we could connect with. And so I want you to feel like this was for you. But the other part of it is to remind you that you've worked too hard to lean out now. And if you deserve whatever you set out to do, and it might look differently, right? It might be not at the table that you've been. Like, I was at one place for 10 years and I had to ask myself, is it worth it? Am I going to get what I need at this place? Or is there another table that's best suited for me? So the last thing is, you have options. Maybe you've hit some road, you're stuck, and or you don't have that quite empire state of mind that you used to. Figure out what that is and give yourself that time to heal, because we've been going through a lot of workplace trauma, and workplace trauma is just as insidious as any other form of harassment. And so give yourself that time to exhale and breathe and figure out what you want, because we need you out here.
So, yes, we do. So I had a question come in around employee resource groups. Have you had any experiences with them, participating, maybe creating them? Do you find them helpful? If so?
Yeah, well, so I do find them helpful. I still think when used properly, right? I don't think employee resource groups should just be for, pizza and foosball, right? There should be something embedded to retain and advance people. And I also think that you can't scale diversity without a budget. There's been so much, so many companies, ERGs, who will call me and want me to come in and speak, and then they don't even have a budget to bring in or to fund their, employee resource groups. And I think in order to scale diversity, it's a business objective, just like any other thing on your sheet. And so I think that we have to invest. To get a return on investment that we want, we have to put an investment there and put the resources behind it. But then also, too, if you're a manager or a leader, there is a great pool of leaders who are volunteering their time in many cases to run these ERGs outside of their day-to-day roles. And so are we looking at them as successors to certain things? I just think that we can't just have these placeholders in groups, but let's utilize them. Let's make sure that they have the resources, the speakers, if you are a leader in the C-suite, even if you're not maybe of color or LGBTQ or a veteran or whatever, that you go to these, right? Let people see that you are an ally, you are an advocate. So I think when it's used properly, I do think that they are effective.
Great. And just a note to the audience, Q&A is open, so please continue to send in your questions. They've been great. So I have one more before we kind of open it up and I'll let some folks ask more questions. So I am an avid reader and I love book recommendations besides yours, which I've read twice. What's one book that you read that's resonated with you or you just really enjoyed?
Oh yeah, thank you. One good book that I've recently read is called The Bold World by Jodi Patterson. It talks about a lot of things, but it's actually about Jodi, the author. She writes about just her activism, but then she also talks about what it was like for her 3-year-old to come to her and say that they were a trans child and kind of her road. And I think that part of my reading repertoire right now is finding out how I can be an ally to someone else, right? And making sure that I'm reading and consuming things so that I don't wait to meet someone in a different, that identifies in a different way than I am, that I'm already ready to have conversations and show up for people. And that starts with some education. So I try to equip myself in that. I'm also reading, what else am I reading? I'm reading Dapper Dan.
Oh, yes, yes.
Dapper Dan.
Yes, his autobiography.
Yes,
it's really good.
And I just finished another book called The Making of a Manager, which I really love, by Julie Zhu is her name. And so it talks about managers and if you're not one, what that looks like to become one and how to manage up and all of those things.
Excellent. So a couple questions are coming in around allyship. So first one is, how do you identify an ally? How do you figure out how to form that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know that we live in this time period where everybody considers themselves an ally. And so I think foundationally, that's a great thing. But what does it look like in action? I think that's the missing ingredient, because so many people say they're an ally, but when it counts, people aren't willing to take the risk, right? And allyship doesn't always have to be, it doesn't have to be a scary thing. So if you have privilege, how, I'm not saying take your privilege away or give up your seat, but can you leverage your privilege to help somebody else who's historically been left behind? And that means we both get a seat, right? Not taking seats away, but adding more chairs. And so I think that we can be that. I gave the example earlier about the car ride. Be an ally when it counts. When someone says something inappropriate, or if there's a woman of color in the room in a meeting and someone speaks over her, you can say, hey, so-and-so, Minda was actually speaking. You can have your comment after. Be there when it counts. And if you're not able to lean into your courage out loud in that way, then at least at the very minimum, go to that person afterwards and say, hey, I'm sorry that I wasn't there in this way. I want to be there for you. But also, too, it goes back to the relationship building. I think that our allies have to build relationships with us as well, right? And so at the core of this is empathy. This is humanity. And so wouldn't you want somebody to step up for you if you were in a situation that called for it? And I think once we see ourselves in each other, it really is coworkers helping each other, right? If I know that my coworker has just been, demeaned in some sort of way, I don't know that I could just keep smiling at them the rest of the day and have not said anything to them. We have to check ourselves and be better, and allyship requires action. And so I would prefer people stop calling themselves allies if they're not ready to be one.
Yes, allyship requires action. That's a major key. So another question around how have you, in continuing the thread around allyship, how have you engaged male allies to help elevate your career?
Yeah, well, because I was the only one, it was allies who definitely helped me get my seat. Particularly white men have helped me as an entrepreneur, but also in my former life as well. But that required me making myself known to them and building my relationships with them. And once they saw that, they could vouch for me, that I was doing what I needed to be doing, right? You also have to be doing the work, right? Oftentimes, at least for us, we have to be doing the work. It's yes and so once they saw that I was, quote unquote, this rock star in their on paper, they could see me in this way in real life. And so it was white men who used their privilege and put me in rooms that I probably had no business being in. And then when other people questioned, should I be at the table, they put their neck out for me. And I'm forever grateful to them. Many of them taught me how to negotiate my salaries, how to ask for what I wanted. And they really took me under their wing. And so I don't know if they ever saw themselves as quote unquote allies. And I never said, will you be my mentor? Will you be my sponsor? Those things evolved, but it was the relationship that really helped. But I also had to learn how to articulate my value and quantify my worth, tell them what I wanted them to do. And I think that's the part that that self-advocacy muscle, we always have to flex it.
Another question around, I know you specifically referenced taking public speaking classes and Toastmasters. I've taken improv classes and I thought that they've been great, especially, if you, because I do speak. And so great way to continue to practice. But what are other resources that you utilize or recommend outside of the office to help elevate your career, whether it's getting new skill sets or maybe refining public speaking or just helping you to gain more confidence?
Yeah, I think in the book I have a whole section on resources, but one thing that I would say is if you haven't done the Clifton Strength Finder assessment, you can Google that, Clifton's, and that is a series of tests that helps you identify what your strengths are and areas for improvement. And I think sometimes being self-aware is great, but then there's also areas that we might not even be thinking about. And so it actually is a really great tool to help you hone in on those things. Another thing I would say is different conferences or meetup groups. If you're industry specific, you can find those things. But if you're thinking about making a career pivot, start to go to, if right now you're in marketing, but you want to go into product management, start attending product management conferences, start going to those ballrooms, right? That exhibition halls that the recruiters in there, find out what they're looking for. I think that, again, we can, the power of the internet, this is social capital. We have the ability to Google, we have the ability to be in places, keep coming to lunch and learns like these, because then you get to ask the questions that are in your head. And so, but take that time to figure out. I would also do personality assessments, because that's also something to know, like who you work well with and who you don't, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of things that we can do to make sure that we are bringing our best versions of work selves to work.
Fantastic. Another question around managing. A few people are first-time managers, others are a little bit more seasoned, but what are some recommendations to better manage diverse teams and help facilitate better relationships and help the teams be more cohesive and avoid conflict?
Yeah, I would really, I definitely would make sure that all leaders read the memo. And that's not just a plug for because I think that sometimes we don't realize what others are dealing with, right? And if you don't know, even if I were a manager, and let's say I was managing a team full of working mothers, right? I'm not a mother. Now I can assume what working mothers might need, flexibility or certain things, but if I don't find out and ask them, build relationships with them, then I can't create a bunch of policies or manage them in a way without having conversation with them. And I think that that's part of this. For so long, we are creating these diversity initiatives, but we're actually not talking to the populations that could benefit from these things. And so I think part of that is understanding cultural competency. So for example, if it's Black History Month and you have, people who identify as African American or from the Caribbean or who see themselves as Black, and nobody says anything about it at work. Nobody, there's nothing on the halls, there's nothing in the walls, you haven't done any celebrations, but yet diversity matters. How do you think it feels to be that person, right? Or if something like a Trayvon Martin happens the night before, and now everyone's in the office, and then you come to that person and be like, we're on a deadline, Keisha, what's, going on, like having some understanding that everybody is dealing with different things. And I think understanding your team members is crucial. But that book that I mentioned, Making of a Manager, that's at all levels before you're a manager, seasoned. But I teach this course at NYU called Talent Development. And I always ask the leaders, how much of your talent do you want to use, right? And that requires you to understand what your team's strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and how we use each other and leverage those for the team's sake. And that's getting to know your team. And it's hard to advance people if you're not invested in their success. And so there's some onus on not just checking the box, but giving good feedback and giving a career plan in which people can succeed, right? And not just your favorites, right? Or so I think there is some onus on managers to be invested in their whole team.
And one last question, and this is around senior leaders, C-suite, for companies who have decided that they now have a diversity and inclusion mandate. What is a piece of advice or a starting point for them? What do you want to make sure that they do if they are interested in not just paying lip service, but really interested in making meaningful and important change within the organization?
Yeah, I think it's as leaders, and we all are leaders, right? Diversity and inclusion, equity, belonging is not just for the C-suite. It's not just for the chief development officer. This is for everybody's job to make it a workplace that people feel like they belong. And diversity does not equate to inclusion, and it doesn't equate to belonging, right? And so I think that we have to understand what these things mean. But what I do think is important is that it's that action again. And so are we doing what we say? So if diversity and equity is inclusion are important, what are the metrics that we're holding people accountable for? So if we're trying to engage diverse talent, what does it look like to retain them, right? Not just getting them into the door, but to advance them, start doing exit interviews, find out why maybe some of that talent is leaving and be honest about those things. But then the other part of it is making sure that there is a pipeline for success. And lastly, don't be afraid to have the hard conversations, right? So if you're not where you want to be, then that's okay. But make sure that you are putting in some metrics and some incentives to make sure that everybody is mandated for success. And so again, diversity doesn't equate to inclusion. And if you don't have any diverse talent right now, what are you doing to create an environment in which they're going to stay? And so there's a lot of things that goes into that. You can go to mindaharts.com and we can talk about that more.
And that is a perfect segue. Where can people find you, connect with you, follow your work?
Yes. So if you go to mindaharts.com, everything is there, the podcast. I'm most active on Twitter at Minda Harts, but just remember, how are you going to make the workplace better than you found it? And it's going to require all of us to do something different.
Excellent. So once again, the Memo, What Women of Color Need to Secure a Seat at the Table, fantastic book. If you don't already have it, go and get it. And I love audiobooks, and Minda read hers, and I'm always a fan of authors, reading their words. So definitely enjoyed that. So if you love audiobooks, I recommend getting that. And once again, thank you so much, Minda, for joining us. Fantastic conversations, conversation that is needed, and continue the great work. And like to thank the audience for joining us today. And again, follow Minda Harts at mindaharts.com.
Yes. Thank you for great moderation. And thank you all. You could be anywhere in the world right now and you were here with us. So thank you, Fairygodboss, for having me.
Thank you so much.